If you're like most kids, you enjoyed playing in forts when you were growing up, imaginary forts, and sometimes you even got to see a real fort. Today we're going to be talking about a real fort right here in Western New York, and one that has amazing, surprising stories about it and why it was so important in the early development of the Greater Western New York region. You're watching the State of Greater Western New York Report, and it's brought to you by... Each week, our community makes history. Each week, you make history. And each week, there's only one source to turn to for the first take on history. You know what that is? Subscribe to the Sentinel right now to discover the history being made in your own backyard. The Menden Honey Lake Falls Lima Sentinel. More than just your news, it's your history. Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the State of Greater Western New York Report. Join us each episode as we discuss fantastic topics ranging from history to science to the strange and the wonderful, as well as the treasured spirit with which our region has infused America. We challenge you to consider all things Greater Western New York, from our region's very beginnings to how it inspires, how it empowers, and why it is so admired. Here's the host of the State of Greater Western New York Report, Chris Carosa. Hi there, and welcome to this week's version of the State of Greater Western New York Report. I'm Chris Carosa, and today we've got an excellent guest, somebody who I think you'll be very excited to hear from. She's Catherine Emerson, and she's the Niagara County historian. Catherine, before we get into the history of Fort Niagara, which is what you're going to be talking about, tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you end up being the historian of Niagara County?
That's rather interesting. I'm actually a native of Pennsylvania, and my husband, when he got his job up here, I came too. I have a master's degree in history, and I just love history, so I've always been working in it since I was a little girl. I knew what I wanted to be, and so here I am.
Well, today we're going to be talking about Fort Niagara. And why don't you just get right into the story? Now, Fort Niagara, as a fort, it really goes way, way far back before there was even a United States. Tell us a little bit about that, how it was initially established, and maybe why it was initially established and by who.
Well, it starts with geography, and you have Lakes Erie and Lake Ontario, and they are joined by the Niagara River, which is actually a strait, but we call it a river. If you control the Niagara River, you control those waterways that go into the interior of the country. And early on, that was your major source of transportation, was these waterways. Now, the problem with the Niagara River is right smack dab in the middle is Niagara Falls. Now, you can't sail a ship up the river, and you can only sail one down once. So you have to, what they call portage around the falls. You have to take your goods out and walk around and put them back on your boat and then sail the rest of the way to wherever you're going. The French very early recognized the importance of this site, and they established a place in what is now Lewiston, New York, called Le Magasin Royal, but it soon became apparent that they needed to go to that point of land right there where the Niagara River empties into Ontario, and that would control the whole portage system. And you can see in the picture there, Fort Niagara was started out as one building, and it expanded into pretty much what you see today with earthworks and other buildings. This is the oldest building. It's called the French Castle, or La Maison au Machicali, or the Stone Mess House, whatever you wanted to call it. It was built in 1726, which makes it the oldest building in the Great Lakes Basin. It's going to have its 300th birthday very soon. It's a wonderful building. It has not been rebuilt. What you see is what was there in 1726. And at the beginning, it basically was the fort. And then as the English start encroaching on French territory and trying to take over the fur trade, the fort expands into pretty much what you see today when you go to visit the fort.
So the British came and started competing with the French, and they did more than compete from an economic standpoint with the fur traders. they did something on their own side of the lake. Tell us a little bit about that, and you know, what was going on. I mean, this is a, I don't remember if you remember growing up when there were gas stations on either side of the street. They would have like price wars with each other or whatever, giveaway wars. I guess this might be very similar, except it was a little bit more serious. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the British took the fort from the French in a siege in 1759. And then, of course, then you have the American Revolution. After the American Revolution, New York, of course, is part of the United States, and across the river, what we now call Canada was still British. They called it Upper Canada. And so the Jay Treaty of 1794, the problem was the British did not hand over a lot of the forts to the Americans after the Treaty of Paris in 1783. This includes Fort at Detroit, a fort at what is now basically Toledo, Fort Niagara, Fort Oswego, a number of other forts along the Great Lakes. And the Jay Treaty demanded that these forts be handed to the Americans. Okay, so Fort Niagara now becomes United States property. The British have already started to settle across the river, and now they're going to build Fort George. And there's only about 1,000 yards between Fort Niagara and Fort George. And that's also when you have Niagara on the Lake is being settled, what have you. So you have these two forts that are in very close proximity to each other. And that will play out in the War of 1812.
So in the War of 1812, we're going to devote really the second portion of the show to what exactly happened there in the fort. But tell us a little. You know, I remember going to Fort Niagara when I was a kid, and I went to the souvenir shop, and I got a little thing with 3 flags on it: French, British, and American flags, because those are the 3 countries that had the fort. When was Fort George built, and what kind of was going on before the War of 1812 between the two sides there? Why was it a contested area?
Well, again, it has to do with the whole portage system, that the British wanted to portage around the Niagara Falls. The Americans needed to portage around Niagara Falls to get into the interior reaches of both countries. And so that's why they built Fort George on their side of the lake. Now, during the Revolution, when Fort Niagara was a British-held fort, and although there was no Revolutionary War battles, a lot of natives and colonists who supported the British, called loyalists or Tories, depending on what side you're on, came to Fort Niagara because it was held by the British. And there were so many of them that a number of them just crossed the river and lived over there. So you have Butler's Barracks being built. You have a thing even earlier than that that was Navy Hall, it was called, and that will get destroyed a number of times and eventually become Fort George. And you can see in this picture there's Fort Niagara in the background. It's just this, you just have to cross the river and there you are. And Butler's Rangers were stationed over there during the American Revolution. And that's one of the reasons why you find Niagara on the Lake, which at that point was called Newark, older than Youngstown or Lewiston, New York, because what American is going to settle next to a British-held fort? Not too many.
All right, so let's go back to our next question. So this is Navy Hall. You started to say that this started off as a hall, it got destroyed a few times, and eventually it became Fort George. There was something that was kind of interesting about the construction of Fort George itself. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
It was wood. Fort Niagara is stone. Uh, some of it was quarried here. Some of it was came from the other end of the lake. But a lot of the buildings were stone. It did have wooden buildings inside. When you go today, there's large open spaces. There wouldn't have been in the 18th and the early 19th century because there was a lot of wooden buildings. There was a chapel, there was a number of barracks buildings, there were guardhouses, all kinds of stuff. Fort George, on the other hand, was all it was a wooden fort, except pretty much for their powder magazine. For good reason, the powder magazine was made out of stone, because you certainly don't want your powder magazine to blow up. That could cause some real bad damage.
So tell us a little bit about what was going on the river. Here we see the entire river from Lake Erie to Lake Ontario. The forts are at the north end, on the shore, where Lake Ontario was. How did they, or were they, concerned at all about the rest of the river in terms of portage, or is it the rapids were too much for people to actually cross the river?
Well, when you portaged, you took your boat to about where Lewiston is. It was called the Upper Landing, and you would then walk your goods up the side of the river to above the falls. The French, the end of their portage was very close to the falls itself. The English built their portage about where the intakes are today, during the pre-1812 period. Regardless, you had to paddle pretty fast when you first started to keep going into Lake Erie. Now, Fort Erie was built, and you can see it there on your map, at the entrance to the Niagara River by the British, and I'm not sure the year that it was built, but it was fairly early on, and it's opposite the settlements of Buffalo and what was known as Black Rock at the time. So the main thing was to protect the portage, so that you could get your goods, because the portage, when you use the lake and the river systems, you can go all the way down to New Orleans pretty much without it using water as your main form of transportation.
So tell us a little bit about what led up to the War of 1812. Why was this region so contested? I mean, I know that you mentioned the Jay Treaty before about trying to settle who owns what, but it really kind of wasn't settled. And what were the British doing to sort of aggravate things around the Niagara River?
Use the back of the blue book if necessary. No. Among other things, the British were holding on to these forts that were supposed to be turned over to the Americans. They were by the Jay Treaty. Unfortunately, the British, among other things, kept impressing American seamen on the high seas, because after all, they are fighting Napoleon at this time. You also have the fact that the British do not recognize American naturalization. In their mind, once you are a British citizen, you are always a British citizen. And this will come into play later when we talk about Betsy Doyle. And for America to attack Britain when she declares war on the British Empire, where do you attack? Are you going to put everybody in a boat and go, shoot at London? No. The nearest British-held lands are right across the river from us, from Fort Niagara. So that's where you're going to attack the British.
All right. Well, hey, if you're watching live, and yes, you are watching live, at least a few people are, and you have a question that you'd like me to ask Catherine, please put it in the chat room or in the Q&A, and I will ask her a question when we start the second half of the show, right after this message. Through the mists of time, nature and man have both created and buried treasures beyond the imagination. With the ages, these riches slowly dissolve into mere myths until they are forever forgotten. But there are those brave souls who tirelessly cling to the truth, ever seeking to discover the undiscovered, to reveal what has always been there, to uncover the hidden gems of a land thought forsaken but loved by millions. 50 Hidden Gems of Greater Western New York. Discover the secrets in your own backyard. Buy your copy now at 50hiddengems.com. Welcome back to the State of Greater Western New York Report, and we do have a question, and it's actually a timely question given what we were just talking about. And Catherine, this person asks about the burning of Buffalo. Now, I'm not sure if this person is a loyalist or a Tory, whatever you call them, but they said, isn't it kind of like America's fault that Buffalo got burned? Because, after all, didn't the Americans first burn, what was it, Newark or some other place?
Newark, Niagara on the Lake is what they're talking about. Actually, the British have a very long history of just going up and burning cities. If you read in the American Revolution, they burned a number of places in Maine, in Rhode Island, whatever. This was nothing new in British tactics. The Americans in 1812 and 1813 burnt Niagara on the Lake, Newark, yes. They did, though, give the population notice. They said, we're going to be burning this town. You've got 2 hours to evacuate, which is certainly less than what they did to Buffalo and Lewiston and every place in between. They just came and did what they do best.
Yeah. And that particular story is a story for another day. But let's talk about the Fort Niagara story with regards to this. And why don't you lead it in? Because it's a really interesting story about a person who kind of stepped up. And why did she do this?
Well, there was a woman by the name of Betsy Doyle. She was erroneously labeled Fanny Doyle in an 1848 book, and it just kept getting repeated and repeated and repeated. We were able to find a couple of years ago that her name was actually Betsy Doyle. She was the wife of Andrew Doyle, who was in the 1st Artillery Regiment. He was he had enlisted in 1810, and so she would have been what they call a woman of the army. She would have gotten partial pay. She'd have gotten rations. She was a laundress or a nurse. These were jobs that women would do for the army. Her husband was taken at the Battle of Queenston as a prisoner. They discovered that he had been born in Canada, and so they put him on a boat and sent him to England to be tried for treason because, as I had said earlier, once you are a subject of the king, the British considered you always a subject of the king. He is taken to Dartmoor Prison, which was a nasty, nasty place to be, and is there for the remainder of the war. Betsy stays at Fort Niagara after the Battle of Queenston because General Brock had been killed. There was a 30-day truce is declared to bury Brock so both sides can lick their wounds and kind of recover from this battle. And then on November 20th, there is the truce is over, and Fort George starts firing on Fort Niagara, and you end up having a 12-hour from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. bombardment with cannon. Betsy takes the hot shot, which is a cannonball that is a cherry red. It's more of a burgundy cherry, and she would take the hot shot, she would heat it in a fireplace, probably on the second floor of the castle, and she'd take it up to the third floor of the castle. Because what they have done is they have taken the roof off of the castle, because the castle is to give it the artillery advantage over Fort George. And these are the steps she would have been running up and down all day with that 6-pound red hot shot in skirts, and there was no railing at that point. And hot shot, there have been experiments done by the British, and also that were done recently at Fort Niagara, where you heat the cannonball like that, and you can put it in water for a minute, and the water boils, and then you can put it on the ground, and it will still ignite gunpowder. That's how dangerous this stuff is. And the man commanding Fort Niagara at the time was a fellow by the name of Lieutenant Colonel George McFeely. And he wrote in his diary and also in his official papers about this woman named Betsy Doyle, Mrs. Doyle, who is delivering hot shot to the battery during this bombardment. He also records in his diary at this time how at one point in one of the cannons using hot shot, it blew up, and one of the men lost both his hands from above his wrist down. I mean, that's how dangerous this is. Fort George is basically decimated because of hot shot, and being the wooden fort that it was. So she does this all day, and it's written up, it's in official papers, and she continues after this is all over, living at the fort. In December of 1813, the Americans know that the British are going to come over and they're going to try to take the fort. It's just become untenable. And there was a letter that was written, and by Colonel Simon Larned, or Learned, if you will, and he said that Betsy, on a cold and wintry night, put on the arms and accoutrements of stood guard, even though it was so cold and nasty, because after all, the militia were rather timid. Unfortunately, the next evening, morning actually of December 19th, 5 a.m., the British take Fort Niagara. Betsy is able to leave. She runs out of the building. She like a lot of the people during the burning of Western New York, this map shows about where we think she went. This is a picture taken on the 200th anniversary of the capture of Fort Niagara, by the way. But she runs all the way to Batavia and just keeps going to the Army Center, which is the cantonment of Greenbush. And you can see it there on this map. It is south and east of Albany. We figure that's about a 310-mile trek, according to Google Maps. And she is doing this in winter with children. Now, whether they were all her children or not, we don't know. At that point, when you read anything about the burning of Western New York, you just grabbed people and ran and figured you'd figure out who belonged to what family later, and that seems to be what she did. She ends up at this Greenbush cantonment, which was a huge army center. It had 4,000 people there. British POWs were kept there. They had a hospital, 8 huge barracks buildings, and when she arrives there in April of 1814, so it takes her 4 months, from December to the beginning of April, the colonel there, this Colonel Larned, writes how she has come from Niagara. Her husband has been taken to England, and that she is a very worthy and industrious woman. She stays at Greenbush for another 4 or 5 years. She and her husband, Andrew, never get back together again because he didn't know where to look. They don't have Google back then, and Facebook and telephones even. And so he ends up coming back to the United States in August of 1815 to Buffalo, or to Boston, and we don't know what condition he's in. He has been a POW for 3-4 years. he's probably not in real good shape. Anyway, he ends up marrying a Nancy Sherman in 1819 and is a rather successful farmer in Swansea, Massachusetts. Betsy stays at the cantonment, and there is a letter that was written in 1819 that says that she has died, unfortunately, and even though she hadn't been paid for over a year, she had continued to work. Now, these pictures you see here are signage that have been added telling the story of Betsy Doyle, and her story. She is probably one of the best documented women to serve a cannon during this period. You have Margaret Corbin and Mary Ludwig Hayes Macaulay, better known as Molly Pitcher, in the Revolutionary War, but there is some question about whether they indeed served or not. I personally think they did, but that's another story. And the interesting thing is that this Colonel McFeely, who was in charge of Fort Niagara, is from Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and that's where Mary Ludwig Hayes Macaulay lived. And I think if he didn't know her, he would have known of her. And that's why I think he mentions Betsy in his official correspondence and in his journal.
So tell us again, when did they realize her real name was Betsy and not Fanny? I was kind of curious about that.
About 2011.
which is why we have this modern looking snippet here referring her as Fanny.
Fanny Doyle. That marker was put up in 1934 by the Daughters of 1812, and it's at the place there on the third floor of the castle, about where the gun was that Betsy served. And there's a great story in 1813, a bunch of shaved-tailed lieutenants come up, and they've heard this story of Betsy Doyle and this woman who has served the cannon, and they think of her as being something like a Joan of Arc. And so they go up to the third floor of the castle, and they request that she comes up, and she presents herself, and they say that she's kind of like this witchy gypsy character that was well known at that time, called Meg Morales. I see Betsy, she's been doing laundry, and she's sitting there going, yeah, right, guys. You know.
Yeah. So it's so what else do you think when people talk to you about Fort Niagara, what's the most popular question that they often ask you?
Is that London across the lake? It's actually Toronto. I like to think of Fort Niagara as a boom with a view. It's a beautiful site. It has been a military installation until 1963. The fort itself that we know today in the 19th century becomes obsolete. And so they move the military out to what is now the state park, and they just had officers living in the French castle and such. And so really the Fort Niagara starts out with muskets, and when they decommission it in 1963, you're using missiles then, because it was part of the whole DEW line and the missile defense system at that time.
From muskets to missiles, Fort
Right.
Niagara. So if people go to Fort Niagara right now, what do they see? Are there activities there? Are there reenactments? What are the sort of things that they can see?
There are reenactments. You can go to their website, and they have the different activities listed there. Unfortunately, they are closed at this time of year on Mondays and Tuesdays, and with COVID and everything, do check the site first for information. They have civilians, they have a native presence, they do military, there's cooking and laundry and hotshot demonstrations and reenactments, and yeah.
Lots of things to do, lots of fun things to do. Again, I remember going there when I was a kid, very amazed that I could actually go inside a real fort. Well, Catherine, thank you very much for being part of today's show. You've been wonderful and very informative, and I can tell by our response from the audience that they really enjoyed hearing what you had to say. I want to remind everybody, if you want to be part of the live audience, then all you need to do is go to stateof.greaterwesternnewyork.com, all spelled out, stateof.greaterwesternnewyork.com, and you can sign up to get a free invitation for this event every Thursday at noon. All right, thank you all. Thank you again for being a part of today's show, and we'll see you all next week.